Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Beatles Forever. We're continuing to go through Peter Brown's book, The Love You Make. It's been interesting to get Peter's perspective on the Beatles and Brian Epstein, so let us see what we can find out today. On June 15th, 1965, the Beatles were awarded the Member of the British Empire, or MBE. It is the lowest rank of the Order of Chivalry, and it usually went to philanthropists, but it was a great honor for a rock group or anyone in their mid-20s. Brian was not included, but he felt that it was because he was gay and Jewish, and he was right. Paul, George, and Ringo were very happy to receive the award, but John wasn't. He hated the idea. He always had made the royals and class structure in England a target of his, and he felt guilty joining in with them. When he got a letter from the Queen's spokesman, he was disgusted. He threw the letter in a pile of fan mail and never answered it. Buckingham Palace asked Brian about the letter, and Brian had a letter sent out saying that John accepted. The older MBEs weren't that thrilled that the Beatles were getting the honor, and a few of them returned their medals because, as an army officer said, he didn't want to share the honor with vulgar nincompoops. George Harrison said to the reporter, "If he doesn't want his medal, he better give it to us, then we can give it to our manager, Brian Epstein." So that was nice of him. John, when he found out, said, "Army officers get awards for killing people. We received ours for entertaining. I'd say we deserve ours more." John said the real reason they got the award was because of the money. On the day of their awards, the largest and youngest crowds gathered at Buckingham Palace. They cried out, "God save the Beatles!" And the Beatles that day were giggling. They were high. John had brought several joints in his boots, and they went to a small toilet off a private ante-room and smoked a joint among them. They tried to expel the smoke through a small window. John was hoping that Prince Charles was around to smoke a joint with him. He was 16, and John figured he might be a Beatle fan. But I don't think the Queen and her husband would have been happy about that, and luckily he wasn't there that day. At the time the Beatles were touring, and when they were nearing the last date of the tour, Brian was in low spirits. His friend Nat Weiss was with him and worried about him. Brian's phone would ring constantly at any time with calls from all over the world. It could be a fan club promoter or a photographer or a radio station that offered that they would give the Beatles a Cadillac car in exchange for some promotion. Brian would laugh at that and say, "Only if it's gold," before hanging up the phone. Sometimes Brian would get away from it all and stay with Nat in his small 2-bedroom apartment. Then he would rearrange all the furniture until he was happy with the way it looked. Nat was amazed how Brian stayed up all night talking and playing Beatle records and be fresh in the morning. Then Nat noticed that when Brian reached in his jacket pocket to get a pen, he spotted a row of little pockets. Brian said that they were pill pockets, and each one was stocked with a different strength by amphetamine or tranquilizer. Then he realized it was the pills keeping Brian going, and sometimes Brian could be out of control. There was a show for Cilla Black in New York. Brian threw a party for her in a hotel suite upstairs. The party was crowded with press and New York show business personalities. And then some woman said the lobby of the Plaza Hotel looked Jewish. Brian screamed, "Madam, I happen to be Jewish," and the lady apologized and left. But Brian shook with anger for hours and made himself miserable. Nat realized if Brian was happy in his personal life, he would be more at peace with himself and learn to enjoy his professional life more. While in New York, Diz came back into the picture. He wanted to see Brian, but Nat said no. Diz said, "Brian's got lots of money. If he wants me to stay away, I'd have a car, I'd go away." Nat relayed the conversation to Brian, and Brian insisted that Nat give him $3,000. Nat was against the idea, thinking if he was given money, he would come back for more. In return for the money, Diz agreed to be locked into a hotel room at the Warwick Hotel with a private guard hired by Nat until the Beatles and Brian left town. So after that, Diz disappeared, and no one knew how long he was going to be gone. George Harrison got married on January 21st, 1966, and this would be a very happy time for George. He was in love, and he was getting along well with John and Paul at this time. He and Patty were an admired couple, and Patty was a warm, caring girl with good sense and good taste. During this time, the Beatles made Rubber Soul and Revolver. Rubber Soul was a critical disappointment. It was in the top 10 album charts for 7 months, but kids were confused by the songs. They expected to hear more juvenile songs. But marijuana was changing the sound of their music. When the Beatles had the bad experience in the Philippines, They blamed Brian. The Beatles in their interconnecting rooms drank scotch and cokes and passed joints and talked about Manila. Neil Aspinall said that Brian's got another world tour already booked for next year. George said, "Is this an annual event?" John said no one could hear a bloody note anyway. "No more for me. I say we stop touring." The Beatles told Brian about their decision on the plane from New Delhi to London. After the American part of the tour was over, they didn't want to go on the road again, at least not in the foreseeable future. This, of course, upset Brian. By the time the plane got to Heathrow Airport, his body was covered with hives and welts. He was so sick the plane's pilot radioed ahead for an ambulance to meet them at the airport. Brian asked, "What will I do if they stop touring? What will be left for me?" And Peter told him, "Don't be ridiculous. There's lots for you to do." Brian had plenty of opportunities, but without the Beatles to consume his time, Brian saw nothing ahead for him. The hives turned out to be glandular fever, and he was put to bed for a month. He went to Wales to recuperate on the doctor's advice to go on a quiet vacation. 4 days later, Brian heard about the trouble the Beatles were in, with John's statement that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus Christ. Brian flew back to Heathrow and then got a flight to New York. He asked Nat what it would cost to cancel the tour. He said the boys have suffered enough abuse this year already. Nat said it would cost millions of dollars, and Brian was willing to pay it, but Nat said there was no need to cancel the entire tour. He said that if John made a public apology, it would probably be settled. When Brian told John to apologize, he was mad because what he said was simply telling the truth. He told Brian he would rather not go on tour than to apologize. Brian finally got him to agree to a press conference. The journalist John had talked to tried to explain that John wasn't comparing the Beatles to Christ. He was simply observing that the state of Christianity was weak and that the Beatles were, to many people, better known. He was deploring rather than approving this. When John got to the press conference, he was pale and nervous and tried to explain what he meant. After he did, the reporters glanced at each other, baffled and unappeased. The next question was, "Are you prepared to apologize?" John thought he had. He said, "I'm sorry I said it, really. I never meant it to be a lousy, anti-religious thing. I apologize if that will make you happy. I still don't know quite what I've done. I tried to tell you what I did do, but if you want me to apologize, if that will make you happy, then okay. I'm sorry." He decided he wasn't going to suppress his feelings and thoughts anymore. A few minutes later, he came out against the Vietnam War and America's recent involvement. Brian gently asked John to refrain from choosing sides on this hot issue. John just glared at him in return. The Jesus apology helped some, but there was still tension in the air. When they went to Tennessee, where the KKK picketed the Memphis Coliseum, there was a possibility of a sniper in the large audience, and police were asked to keep an eye out for firearms. Halfway through the concert, someone threw a firecracker on stage from the bleachers, and George nearly fainted from fright. On the 20th in Cincinnati, Paul was so nervous he threw up backstage. On the 24th, they were back in New York at Shea Stadium. They were presented a huge cake in the locker room, and John asked if there was a naked lady inside of it. When they said there wasn't, he said, "We don't want any of your effing cake," and stalked off. Brian told Nat that the Beatles were stopping their touring, and Bryant wasn't himself after his illness. He had missed a lot of the Beatles' tour dates. He would be stoned at the Waldorf Towers. He had liaisons with men, and he told Nat that Diz had come to Los Angeles to see him, and Nat didn't like that. Brian rented a house and had Diz stay with him. Brian told Diz and Nat to go to the Beatles' last concert, and Diz spent the night at the house, but the next morning he went to the bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel where Brian had left his suitcase, and Diz, I guess, had left his suitcase. When Brian and Nat returned to the bungalow later that morning, Diz was gone. So were Brian and Nat's attaché cases. Nat's case had important business documents, but Brian's was worse. It had a large supply of pills. He had photos of his sexual conquest, and there was a paper bag with $20,000. All were missing. Nat tried to console Brian, but he was full of self-hatred and felt terrible that he had been fooled once again. Brian was too upset to attend the Beatles' final concert. Nat said the police should be called, but Brian didn't want to. Brian thought Diz should keep it all and keep bad headlines from showing up. Nat didn't tell Brian, but he didn't want to be a blackmail victim, so he hired a private detective in Los Angeles and set up a phony ransom rendezvous with Diz to take place behind the Union Station in L.A. Diz didn't show up. Instead, it was a young accomplice. He was grabbed by the private detective and turned over to the police. The accomplice led them to the attaché case in exchange for a promise not to press charges. The case had $12,000 in it, but no pills or incrimination letters and photos. Diz had taken $8,000 and disappeared. Brian was upset, thinking that Diz would turn the letters and photographs over to some newspaper. Nat was asked by Brian's doctors to spend 2 days with him so he wouldn't be alone. Brian laid around his pajamas most of the days, and even at dinner most times, and he had morbid conversations and nostalgic conversations. It seemed he had given up. He stayed up until dawn every day, and then he slept till 5 in the afternoon, avoiding business responsibilities. One night, after Brian went to his room, it was just after dinner, and it wasn't like him, so Nat checked in on him a few times. He was asleep, but he was still in the same position. Nat tried to wake him up with no luck, so he called Dr. Cohen. The doctor advised him to take him to the nearest hospital to get his stomach pumped, but Nat didn't. He was afraid someone from the hospital would spill the beans, and if the pills didn't kill him, the bad publicity would. When the doctor got there an hour later, Nat still couldn't revive Brian, and the doctor kept Brian breathing in the back seat as they sped to the hospital. He had his stomach pumped, and he was semi-conscious after that. Nat asked Brian, "What's the matter with you? How could you try to do something like that? You have so much to live for." And Brian said it was a foolish accident. He just took 1 pill too many. He said, "I didn't mean to do it. I promised to be more careful from now on." When Nat got back to the house, he found out it wasn't an accident. On Brian's night table, next to an empty bottle of pills, there was a suicide note that said, "This is all too much, and I can't take it anymore." It said, in part, he left a short will and testament to his house to his mother and Clive, his brother, and Nat was also to get a small portion. Nat took the letter to the hospital the next day and confronted Brian. He was grateful that Nat didn't tell anyone, and Nat wasn't too sure that not saying anything to the doctor was wise. Brian took the letter from him and said he was going to burn it, and he never did. When he left the hospital, he went away to a drying out clinic for detoxification and rest. So I will end the video here, and we find out that once again, fame and money don't bring happiness. In those early days, the Beatles were so excited and happy about being famous. Later, they found out there were pitfalls, and when John made a statement that angered so many, it made them all nervous about their safety. They didn't enjoy touring anymore, all the hassles and not feeling safe. Brian wasn't happy with all the business deals that had gone wrong. He had success, but he also made some costly mistakes. His fling with Diz caused him endless stress, worrying about being blackmailed. That and the Beatles not touring anymore, it made Brian feel like giving up. We're nearing the end of Peter Brown's book, and it's been interesting, even though the book wasn't a favorite of the Beatles. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated, as always. Tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you.